It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Masha Gessen, as it is a pleasure and an honor that we have them at Bard College among us and teaching with us. Masha is a distinguished writer and resident at Bard, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and the author of 11 books of nonfiction, including The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the 2017 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and most recently, Surviving Autocracy. Masha is currently working on a book about imaginative political projects. They are the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Nieman Fellowship, and other honors. They live in New York City. If you're like me, we've been reading Masha's work now for many years, but there was no more powerful moment than reading their piece in the New York Review of Books, Rules for Survival, Autocracy, Rules for Survival. And I remember, as I think many others do, first reading that piece and taking their advice. The first two pieces of advice: believe the autocrat. Do not be taken in by small signs of normality. I think many of us were struggling with that in 2016 when they wrote that, and looking back, their comments seem searingly true. We could say prescient, and that's also true, but the fact that they were so closely based on Masha's experience in autocracy and the ability to see clearly, including some of the mistakes that had been made, and the sense that this was a period of exception, an exceptional moment when we needed to respond with vigor. And as they wrote in more detail in Surviving Autocracy, that exception wasn't just Trump. That exception began, the breach was open before, but they were able to take advantage of it in very particular ways. I think others probably have had experiences also encountering Masha's work, and it's really thrilling to have them here to discuss today with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Peter, and thank you, Roger, for that gracious apology. And it's great to be here. This is the second time I've spoken at the ARN conference. The first time, this wasn't my home institution, and it's really lovely to be here as a Bardian. My talk is not about citizen assemblies, and it's not about sortition. But when Roger asked me to talk about this, it made sense to me. So I hope it makes sense to you that I'm talking about this, about the Parallel Polis. And the way that I started thinking about it was that I've been working for a number of years now on this book about imaginative political projects. And as I was sort of trying to figure out the scope and the theoretical underpinnings of the book, and as my partner made fun of me for getting into possibly writing a book about collective farming, I finally came across this concept that I had been familiar with from actually growing up in the Soviet Union, and that I found incredibly refreshing and rich the more I looked into it. It also comes with a great story, which makes it one of my favorite kind of concept. So the story actually goes back to 1968, which was a year that, in addition to seeing an incredible amount of protest and sort of foment in the capitalist world, also saw a great amount of protest in the Soviet bloc. And it was also the year of mass student demonstrations in Warsaw, the year of what came to be known as Prague Spring, which was an attempt sort of rejuvenate Czechoslovak socialism with the hopes of creating a socialism with a human face that was ultimately brutally cracked down on by Moscow. And after that crackdown came a real reckoning for both Czechoslovak and Polish dissidents. What were they going to do now? Now that the hopes for reforming the governments that they had seemed to be completely crushed. What would they do? Should they go into exile? Should they forswear action because it was deadly and useless? Should they resort to blind faith hope? And were there other options? And I think that the thinking of Czech, Polish, and Soviet dissidents from that period and the answers that they produced changed the world and could change the world again. And I don't want to come across as somebody who romanticizes the thinking of that took place in those places at a time when protest leaders were forced to go into exile or go underground. I'm sticking with Arendt's point that thinking under tyranny is very difficult, and thinking in a state of high anxiety is even harder, and thinking while experiencing isolation is close to impossible. But these men and women actually found ways not to be isolated, and that's where the great story comes in. They found a way to think together and to talk together. In August 1978, 8 people met on a hiking trail in the mountains that separated Poland from Czechoslovakia. The trail was called, unironically or ironically, the Trail of People's Friendship. And they figured out that they could meet on this trail right on the border between the two countries without getting arrested. Most of them had had their passports confiscated, so they couldn't actually travel from one country to the other. And so they met there to sort of sit around in the woods and talk, and they met again a month later, and they scheduled a third meeting, which was foiled by the secret police. But they continued to collaborate, and they continued to use the Trail of People's Friendship, writing to one another, publishing one another, and actually sometimes publishing in the other country's language so that the books could be smuggled into, or the books' brochures could be smuggled into the country in the language of which they were printed without being tracked to the place where they were printed. Václav Havel was one of the 8 people who gathered on the Trail of People's Friendship, and Adam Michnik was another person who was there. They always ended their mountaintop meetings with a written joint statement that was very formal and flowery, but as Havel later summarized, it boiled down to, "We're together and we want democracy." And there was such joy in that summary. It says that possibility, the fact, the belief, the proof that something is possible, is an essential element of hope. And hope was actually the subject of the conversation that they were having. The conversation began with a very pointed exchange almost immediately after the protests were crushed in 1968. Milan Kundera, the novelist, published an essay called Czech Destiny, in which he argued that the protests revealed something glorious about the national character and the nation's role in the world. And he wrote, "The hearts of Czechs should be filled with pride and hope." Havel responded with an angry essay titled Czech Destiny with a question mark, in which he mocked Kundera's construction as kitschy and illusionistic, a past-oriented invitation to passivity, when what was really needed was to, quote, "throw off all illusions and unequivocally decide what it is we want and what we want to do to get it." Kundera, in response, accused Havel of moral exhibitionism and wallowing. He wrote that 1968 was the year when we began, at long last, to bring to renewed fruition our own Czechoslovak possibility. I don't think they were listening to each other very well, or reading each other very well, but really they were both trying to define, or to find a definition of hopeful political action. And in 1971, the Polish philosopher in exile, Leszek Kolakowski, joined the conversation in an essay called In Stalin's Countries, Theses on Hope and Despair, which also has been translated as Hope and Hopelessness. And Kolakowski argued for what he called a reformist orientation, which is not to say that he believed that the system itself was capable of reform, but he was calling on Poles to stop waiting for a miracle or hoping that a single blow from an unpredictable source could slay the regime. He argued that pressure applied over the long term would yield results. And I'll quote, "The rigidity of a system depends in part on the degree to which the men who live within the system are convinced of its rigidity." And conversely, he wrote, "The emergence of a movement depends to a large extent, though not entirely, on the belief of the public in the possibility of such a movement. Individuals who, in the countries of socialist despotism, can give rise to hope are also participants in a movement which can make this hope a reality." And in 1976, Michnik responded with an essay called The New Evolutionism. Now note that, like, the incredible time span over which they're having this conversation. And he's basically updating Kolakowski's idea of the reformist orientation, and he's arguing that the opposition's efforts should be directed not at changing the totalitarian government, but on engaging the minds of ordinary people. And he concluded, quote, "Opposition intellectuals are striving not so much for a better tomorrow as for a better today. Every act of defiance helps us build the framework of democratic socialism, which should not be merely or primarily illegal institutional structure, but a real day-to-day commonality of free people." In another 2 years, Czech dissidents attempted to put their ideas together in a collection of essays. And the best known of them, many of you have probably read. This is Havel's The Power of the Powerless. But I think the most influential essay was actually a different one, and I'll get to it in a second. So Havel, like Kolakowski, argued that the regime, which he called post-totalitarian, but I think maybe is better described as actually existing totalitarianism. And what I mean is that in the early stages of a totalitarian regime, it relies on terror, and this is often what we mean when we talk about totalitarianism, but once it's been established, it finds an economy of terror and turns its own ideology into solely a system for signaling loyalty. And this is the kind of system that Havel referred to as post-totalitarian. So Havel observed that the system depended on the constant quotidian cooperation of its subjects. And so this is a famous quote from that essay: "They must live within a lie. They need not accept the lie. It is enough for them to have accepted their life with it and in it. For by this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. And the system," he continued, "works only as long as people are willing to live within a lie." He called this autototality, the way in which the regime's subjects maintain the regime without evident pressure from above. And so it followed that real opposition means living within the truth. And this is the power of the apparently powerless. They can withdraw their cooperation. Havel wrote, "This power does not participate in any direct struggle for power. Rather, it makes its influence felt in the obscure arena of being itself. That arena may, probably will, produce something visible, a real political act or event, a social movement, a sudden explosion of civil unrest, a sharp conflict inside an apparently monolithic power structure, or simply an irrepressible transformation in the social and intellectual climate." And he wrote that it is impossible to predict when a small act or a series of small acts of living within the truth will give rise to a larger and more recognizably political phenomenon. More important, that's not the goal of such resistance. And I'll quote again, "It is of great importance that the main thing, the everyday, thankless, and never-ending struggle of human beings to live more freely, truthfully, and in quiet dignity, never impose any limits on itself, never be half-hearted, inconsistent, never trap itself in political tactics, speculating on the outcome of its actions, or entertaining fantasies about the future." On the other hand, he wrote that the purpose of living within the truth is not a retreat from the larger society as an act of isolation, addressing itself only to the welfare of those who had decided on such a course and who were indifferent to the rest. And another Václav Benda, who was a mathematician and philosopher, wrote what I think was actually the most influential essay in that collection. And he gave this idea its name, which is the Parallel Polis. He wrote that, quote, "We join forces in creating, slowly but surely, parallel structures that are capable, to a limited degree at least, of supplementing the generally beneficial and necessary functions that are missing in the existing structures, and where possible, to use those existing structures to humanize them." Benda used two very different examples of parallel structures that were already functioning and already vital. What the Czechs called second culture, which included underground theater, samizdat, unofficial music, and all the other cultural production that existed under the censor's radar or in spite of the censor's prohibitions. And the other example, which was controversial even at the time, was the shadow economy. All that could be procured through bribes, connections, or other mechanisms that filled the gaps left by central planning. And he suggested adding to that the underground education, a parallel university. Add everything, said Havel, picking up the idea of the parallel polis. He conjured, quote, "an area where a different life can be lived, a life that is in harmony with its own aims, and which in turn structures itself in harmony with those aims." He imagined the efforts of a certain part of society to live as a society within the truth, to rid itself of the self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism, and thus to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the post-totalitarian system. Now notice that Benda uses the word polis. Havel stresses that parallel structures model a life as society. So they're not talking about individuals or families or even close-knit communities of like-minded people separating themselves from the larger world and going into some utopian version of internal exile. They're talking about the inherently political work of different people figuring out a way to build a society together. So these were the great discoveries of the Czechoslovak and Polish dissidents thinking, talking, and writing in the 1970s. That totalitarianism is not actually total, in the sense that it doesn't exert direct pressure on each of its subjects every moment of every day. That even under totalitarianism, there exists a space for not only individual but collective action, which need not be limited to protesting and confronting the regime. That hope is a function of the imagination, and imagination is a function of hope. Havel wrote, "The real question is whether the brighter future is really always so distant. What if, on the contrary, it has been here for a long time already, and only our own blindness and weakness has prevented us from seeing it around us and within us, and kept us from developing it?" The amazing part is that not only did they theorize this, but this actually became reality in Poland. Havel sent The Power of the Powerless to Michnik, who ensured it was disseminated in Poland. The essay reached Polish labor organizers who had been protesting since 1976. One of them later said, "We had been speaking on the shop floor, talking to people, participating in public meetings, trying to speak the truth about the factory, the country, and politics. There came a moment when people thought we were crazy. Why were we doing this? Why were we taking such risks? Not seeing any immediate and tangible results, we began to doubt the purposefulness of what we were doing. Then came the essay by Havel. Reading it gave us the theoretical underpinnings for our activity. The quote comes from Zbigniew Bujak, a leader of the Solidarity trade union movement. He was a 22-year-old electrician at a tractor factory in Ursus, outside of Warsaw in 1976. When workers around the country protested, walking out on work, marching, and looting in response to consumer price increases planned by the government. The protests lasted a week before the government crushed them. 42 people were arrested. The Ursus protests were an extraordinary event, but not a unique one. Factory workers had staged desperate and sometimes deadly protests in Poland and elsewhere in the Soviet bloc before, including actually in Russia. What was different and truly unprecedented about Polish protests occurred a few months after the 1976 walkouts. 14 intellectuals, 13 men and 1 woman, gathered in a Warsaw apartment to form what they called the Workers' Defense Committee. Nina Witoszek, a Polish historian in exile, wrote later, "This was an unusual impulse, because usually the intellectuals give the people what the intellectuals want." Witoszek wrote a book called The Origins of Anti-Authoritarianism, and she uses Arendt's concepts of both politics and revolutions, politics as the highest form of human engagement, and revolution as radical political change that brings freedom, to argue that the formation of the Workers' Defense Committee launched one of the 3 great revolutions in human history. The committee, which quickly grew to include 34 members and thousands of supporters, began by attending the trials of worker protesters and collecting donations to help their families. They did this work openly, publishing their own names and phone numbers. Witoszek writes, "In the course of 2 years, the Workers' Defense Committee managed to snatch the information monopoly from the state, build an extensive network of publishers, activate a web of independent universities, and publish Robotnik, the worker, a broadsheet distributed in Polish shipyards and factories." They also formed a network of flying universities, which was a network of lectures organized on a semester scheduled, held underground in private apartments and houses for a handful or several students at a time. The driving principle and the purpose of all this work was solidarity. And again, I'll quote Witoszek, "The result was that suddenly, in the spring of 1980, a parallel society, complete with an independent education system, communication network, and the support of international celebrities, was in place." The committee's public actions broke the spell of what she calls adaptive zombiehood and what Havel called auto-totality, and created what she calls an epidemic of goodness, yielding countless civic initiatives, committees, and projects. She writes, "In the period of 1977 to 1980, the author saw a mass of previously gratefully oppressed or intimidated people slowly turn into an enchanted community of citizens." Witoszek's Enchanted Community is not a fairy tale, but an observed phenomenon. She called the actions idealist pragmatism, which she defines as a life stance that would invoke realism and at the same time demand imaginative transcendence of the here and now. The Polish Parallel Polis collided with the regime in 1980. That summer, workers across the country were striking again in response to rising prices. But this time they had a network of communication and an articulated political platform. Their interconnectedness turned the protests into an indomitable force. The government simply lacked the resources to crush all the protests all at once, especially since news of suppression in one place quickly reached other plants and ports, fueling more protests. In August, the government recognized the right of the workers to organize and signed an agreement with the striking workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk. Their leader was electrician Lech Walesa, and the union called itself Solidarity. In September, Solidarity held its inaugural Congress, declaring itself more than a trade union. It was a wide, self-governing movement, and a movement not only for economic justice. They wrote a very long manifesto, I forget now, I think it was like 89 pages, based on these conversations and these back and forth writing that had been happening now for years. They wrote, "What we have in mind is not only bread, butter, and sausage, but also justice, democracy, truth, legality, human dignity, freedom of convictions, and the repair of the republic. All elementary values have been too mistreated to believe that anything can improve without their rebirth." After 4 years of work, this movement had a comprehensive moral vision that could be put down on paper. It included positions not only on labor, but on education and the status of ethnic minorities. And I'm referring to the work of building chapters. I'm referring not only to the work of building chapters and setting up procedures for decision-making and communication, the sorts of things that we usually mean when we talk about organizing. Though much of this work did happen under the trying conditions of repression and secrecy, but the work of imagining how Polish society could be different. Now the Workers' Defense Committee officially disbanded and folded itself into the larger movement, into the solidarity its members had once conjured. For the next 16 months, millions of Poles became engaged in building the parallel society on the foundation laid by dissidents. Witoszek describes this period as a massive participation in freedom-making. In December 1981, the Polish government, in what may have been an attempt to forestall Soviet intervention, imposed martial law. Many of the activists went into exile. Many others were imprisoned. Parallel society went underground, but continued its work of organizing and imagining. In 1988, when Moscow abruptly loosened its grip on the satellite states, the communist government of Poland suddenly unmoored, sat down at a giant round table, literally, with Walesa, Michnik, and 4 other representatives of Solidarity, and negotiated a peaceful transfer of power. With censorship and restrictions on organizing lifted, the country prepared for free and open elections, which in June 1989, Solidarity won. This had been what Havel had meant when he wrote that the future may already be here, in the present, in the Parallel Polis. In Poland, when the old regime collapsed under its own weight, the new society already existed. In Czechoslovakia, Havel himself was in prison just then. And in July of that year, a delegation of Polish parliament members and Michnik, who was now editor of the country's new and most important newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, returned to the mountain where Polish and Czechoslovak dissidents had met 2 times 11 years earlier. This time the Poles descended triumphantly the other side into Czechoslovakia to visit Havel, who had just weeks earlier been released from prison. Michnik prophesied that Czechoslovakia would soon see its own peaceful revolution. Havel dismissed the analogy and the prediction, saying the Czechs are different. Michnik insisted, before year's end, you will be president. Havel glared at his guest as though at a madman. But Michnik was right. Thank you.
Let me start with just a couple of questions and then turn it to the audience. I guess you've left us with the with the big question of how that you raised at the very beginning about how this might offer us a lesson for today and for us. And as I listen to this story, I mostly want to cry for the kind of the beauty and the clarity of a moment in history, and the sense that I don't see that anywhere myself. I mean, when you characterize whether it's the Havel's characterization of post-totalitarianism, or your own the beautiful line about a regime that's found an economy of terror, it posits the clear story of opposition in a state that is a facade in some ways, where, as you said about Poland, the alternative was already there. And I think we need to ask you to tell us, to make that connection, and to show us why you think in our current space, where left particularly, it seems to me, doesn't have a view of collective action, doesn't understand anymore the notions of collective action, and where the sweep of history, the clock has changed, so that it's hard for me to imagine the kind of Kundera-like resistance or Havel-like resistance in China today, or for that matter, what's happening in Russia today. So help us to connect that.
Yeah, somehow I knew you'd ask that question. I think a couple of points. One is that I think even though solidarity grew eventually into an extraordinarily large movement, I think in general parallel Polis projects are small, right? And I think they're called upon to be small. But I think also that beautiful Havel quote about, maybe the beautiful future is not always so distant, maybe it's here, is in a way an instruction. It's almost like an instruction, a deciphering or reading instruction. It has helped me a lot in my research because I was going to all these different projects and sort of thinking, okay, well, I'm reporting on how to, the book that I'm writing now starts at a farm, a CSA organic farm in Palestine that exists in the shadow of the wall, continues through to a co-living community in Israel, then goes to a whole bunch of projects mostly in the US, a lot of them in Detroit, and then ends with the public transportation system in Medellin. And part of what I think unites those projects to me is that they all demonstrate a different way of being together, acting together. But they also exist in parallel to dominant structures. And because of that, or in the case of the public transportation in Medellin, it's sort of, I end with it because it's an example of something that was imagined into being, sort of willed into being over the course of many, many years, and also represents a different kind of relating and a different way of structuring economic relations. And I can talk about it more if you're interested. But it has come into existence and become the dominant structure. But before that, spent about 20 years being just conjured and imagined. But a lot of the time, we fail to see these structures because we don't have the language and the imagination to recognize them as something other than aberrations or exceptions or just small anomalies, and to think of them as actually existing models of the future.
Or I mean, I think of how when I teach my students and we look at something like what you described that could, in some settings, just be viewed as a kind of a certain effete isolation of the idea of wanting to live in a virtuous network, which we see as a major feature. But it sounds like you're willing to engage those as possible steps toward something that is communal, that the self-consciousness could arise from there to make it a political act that goes beyond.
Right, and I think that all the projects that I've become interested in and am describing, they demonstrate what Eric Fromm called, and I love this phrase, the certainty of the reality of the possibility, right? Which was part of his one of his essays on hope, right? That's what you need to have hope, and he's definitely talking about political hope as the certainty of the reality of the possibility.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've got the connection. Let's turn to questions. Um, do we? I don't know how the. Oh, okay. My eyesight's terrible. I'm sorry. So, but we have someone you have with the microphone. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, house lights help.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Lupu. So,
I'm sorry,
throughout-
could you introduce yourself and speak really clearly through your mask?
Yes,
Project?
hi.
Thank you.
My name is Jennifer Lupu, and my question, so over the last few days we've been learning a lot about citizen power and activism through, to a degree, state-sanctioned or state-recommended councils or conferences. And in this talk, you've been talking about citizen power and activism through something that is against the state, is clearly not state-sanctioned. Do you think that there is the same power for change and for citizen voices through a state-sanctioned approach, or do you think it necessarily loses something in being tied to the existing government in that way, regardless of which context we're talking?
Well, actually, I mean, I don't think that every project we've heard about this for the last couple of days has been state sanctioned or state affiliated. But no, my argument is very much that there are all sorts of relationships between the state and these parallel polis projects that can work, including, and again, I use the example of the public transportation system in Medellin, which actually was the city's initiative, right? And was an incredibly remains an incredibly imaginative and radical political project that was funded largely by the city, not exclusively, and carried out entirely by the city. So I don't, the sort of the parallel polis idea is by no means an anti-state idea or some kind of libertarian utopia.
But thank you, Masha. That was both informative and, as you were saying, it was moving, and it's important to be reminded of the fact that this happened. My question is, I suppose, semi-rhetorical. Suppose we had a society where, say, 40% of the people found themselves in active opposition to central power, where most of those people found that the last election was faked, was false, that these people were in some kind of loose contact with each other. Would one say that that was a parallel polis?
Well, that's a weird hypothetical.
I can't imagine where it came from, but
yeah, I don't think that that could be called a parallel polis because I don't see the imaginative aspect in it at all. I also don't, I don't see a whole lot of politics as an, sort of conversation and trying to figure out how we live together going on. So I think it really doesn't fit the definition of a parallel polis.
I suspect there's more of that than we think because we are not part of that. And I suspect if one went to various parts of the country, you would find, in fact, people talking to each other precisely in the way that you're talking about. But but I'm saying that I think I have evidence for it, but it's hard to know for sure.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, it makes sense to explore that.
Hi, thank you. Sophia Arnold. My question is like, how do you... Oh, okay. Sophia Arnold. My question is, how do you think we can make these parallel polis seen, or like sortition? How do you think we can make it, stop it from being just a fluke in history, just a little idea? How do we make these things more permanent, more official?
Right. So that's a great question, and yeah, and I neglected to say the obvious in response to Peter's question, which is that of course I think of these sortition experiments and citizen assemblies as parallel polis examples, and I also describe them in this book that I'll eventually finish, maybe, and. But I actually spent a lot of time thinking about how do we make them more permanent or more. I mean, you know, the visibility question is kind of simple. That's what that's what we're doing here, right? And we're. I mean, Roger and I were talking yesterday about how citizen assemblies seem to be sort of on this cusp of incredible visibility, right? But they're still at a point where if you're in the know, it feels like it's all the rage and everybody's talking about it, but except nobody knows about it. But that's I think something that, I mean, I think like universal basic income was exactly this kind of phenomenon just a few years ago, and has had this incredible explosion into public consciousness. So I think that's happening through conversation and journalism and book publishing. The question of how to scale things up and make them more permanent is actually, to me, fascinating, because as I started working on this project, I thought, well, you know, what is the scalability, or what is or how permanent can this be? And it was a couple of years before I realized these are really the wrong questions, right? I mean, they are very much the questions that we apply to our existing systems, right? How do we scale this up? How do we make this permanent? And I think, you know, they're not irrelevant, but I think that it's much more useful to think about whether something is reproducible, or even more importantly, whether something is generative, right? And I think that with, you know, the sort of the generativity project is the most, the generativity question is the most important one. Whether something is generative, yeah.
So can I just follow up on that a little bit? Because the examples you've given historically have the intellectual linkage that adds a kind of self-awareness. Is self-awareness a necessary feature? Is political awareness? And I'm thinking, you know, why do we look at Occupy Wall Street? Is Occupy Wall Street a step towards that, or is it a step in another direction? Because there wasn't politics, there wasn't awareness of moving forward. Is Black Lives Matter a step towards that? I mean, where did these like bursts of social activism in the United States fit for you? And just for me, they fit as possibly. I mean, maybe there's generativeness, but there's also a real sign of the inability to do politics that is connected with them.
Right. No, I think they absolutely fit in this framework, and you know, and I think Occupy was incredibly generative. I mean, I think we would be living in a very different society now if it hadn't been for Occupy, right? And we would be thinking about protest in very different ways. And I also think that Occupy was very political. I mean, all they did was try to figure out how to be in that space together.
Without any vision of a permanent, without any vision of politics going forward, or even a will to be able to compromise, negotiate, do politics in these ways.
And yet, you know, the following year at protests, you know, in Russia, there was an Occupy component, and which I think, you know, people still remember and somehow use in their everyday activities and activism, right? I think that last year I was reporting on Occupy City Hall that was part of the Black Lives Matter protests in New York City, which was very clearly a progeny of Occupy. So I think it's definitely generative. It's hard for me to speak to the political imagination of Occupy, but I think it was maybe more present than we realize.
I know we had, so, sir, or I can't see the person who's there.
Thank you. My name is Ilse Erner. My question actually is going to bounce off the gentleman to my left here, and also talking about political imagination with populist movements that we're seeing. Steve Bannon has referred to himself as Lenin, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't know how one comments on that. I think, I think Steve Bannon is a self-identified bullshitter, and everything he says is bullshit. I mean, by definition, by intent, right? Which is kind of the very opposite, I think, of what we're talking about.
But don't we have to acknowledge that there is the creation of polis-like process on the right within these spaces of the 40% or the others, and how do we distinguish it? It's not just you said lack of imagination or political imagination, but can you?
I don't actually think so. I think the goal and the efforts are toward the creation of a mass movement, which is really, really different from the creation of a polis. I mean, a mass movement is an ideologically driven movement with a real separation between the elite leadership and the masses it tries to mobilize. I think it's actually very much sort of in the model of totalitarian movements that Arendt describes.
Although Tea Party mobilization, before it kind of became nationalized and maybe lost that focus on the local, certainly had qualities I mean, it was very ideologically focused on the local and political in that space.
But it was also in confrontation with either the real or perceived regime, right? And actually, everything that I've talked about is a way of thinking about stepping away from the confrontation and toward the building of something. And I think that's a key distinction.
So did we miss someone along the side? There's a hand right here in the middle, and then there's a hand over there on the aisle. Are we taking questions online also, or? I'll take instruction. Sorry? Okay.
I'm Ken Landauer, and first I had a comment, which is that it does seem that polis seems distinctly different from Tracy's example or Steve Bannon's example. First, because those examples are based on fictions, and I think for Arendt that everything has to be based on appearances and contingencies, and they seem very different. And the other part that seems very different to me is that there's not very much contention in those movements. I think she would characterize those not as a polis, but as a mob movement, because of the uniform agreement of those people. That was the comment. But it leads me to the question, which is, are the parallel polises, it seems like they are dormant and they can rise up when the state is in a more fragile state. And I'm wondering if you believe we're in that condition right now.
I think that's a very insightful comment, actually, both of them. And yeah, absolutely, there's the sort of thinking behind the parallel policies in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s, was very much this sort of the regime is going to collapse under its own weight, and here will be. I think it's fairly clear that we are in some state of fragility of our existing, or what we thought was an existing consensus, an existing political system. I think that the problem with fragile states is that you can never know whether that's going to lead, what kind of collapse it's going to lead to, and when exactly that's going to happen. But so I try not to be in the business of making predictions, but I think we know that we're in a fragile state.
I would like you to stay in the business of predictions. I think having been so affected by your predictions in 2016.
Thank you very much, Michael McKenzie. That's a really interesting talk, and I've never heard this term, the parallel polis, before. But I wonder if I can draw some examples looking back instead of forward. And I just wonder what you have to say about some of these examples. So, you know, churches used to do a lot of this, the parish relief or hospitals. And also, you know, family units would provide education and care for elderly and these sorts of things. So, and then there's also the example of organized crime, right? An alternative economy providing insurance, obligatory insurance for businesses, perhaps. You know, these are all examples of activities that occur in states that are lacking capacities or are failing in some respects. Even when the state itself is stable, it's failing to do certain things. And, you know, there are reasons why we want to be able to do these things as a society, as opposed to leaving them to these other processes, like, for example, education. You know, some people got educated when we didn't have proper public systems, but many people didn't. And so I wonder what some of your thoughts are about that kind of parallel, or those examples of parallel, of the parallel polis, and how it fits into, you know, what people were doing in Czechoslovakia and Poland, or what we might be doing now, and some of the dangers of that approach. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I don't think those are great examples of the parallel polis, not because they're somehow not, you know, morally or aesthetically appealing, but because they're actually not examples of a parallel polis. I mean, I think that what's interesting about Benda's example of the shadow economy in Czechoslovakia is that it's not actually a mafia economy, right? It's not centralized. It actually requires a whole lot of self-organization and negotiation. And he's by no means arguing that that's an optimal way of existing, right? He's arguing that there is a possibility there that that has appeared because the state or the larger society has failed to provide for its citizens, or to provide its citizens with ways to create a non-shadow economy. But he's not arguing that there should be no state, right? And I think that's a really important part of all of this writing. I think family units are also not a great example because, and again, they're very specific about this, right? That there has to be conversation across differences and negotiation. I think, you know, most family units are not terribly democratic and kind of more homogenous than a polis would be. Right? Churches also not usually most mainstream religions known for political conversation tend to be fairly hierarchical structures. I think to the extent that historically there have been certainly religious communities that weren't either locally or in a larger level, I think that is an example of a parallel polis.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nia Inoue. I just wanted to, I guess, ask a clarifying question about the relationship between the parallel polis and the state, because you, I think in response to Peter, suggested that the Tea Party, for example, wouldn't be a parallel polis because it was in the business of creating a mass movement against the state rather than engaging in a kind of negotiation about how to transform the state. I may be misinterpreting you, but then you seem to suggest that Occupy is an example of a parallel polis. Occupy, I think, was also a mass movement, or trying to be a mass movement, right? And that it was ideologically diverse, but definitely there was a strong anarchist influence that was anti-state, right? So I'm wondering, I just want to hear more about how you're thinking about the relationship between the parallel polis and the state.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm trying to make two separate points with the movement and the relationship with the state, right? So I think that what we're seeing on the right now, especially, is an attempt to create a totalitarian movement, right? By leading, by mobilizing the masses, which is pretty much the opposite of what I'm describing when I'm talking about the parallel polis. And I don't think Occupy was that, right? So that's what I was referring to when I was talking about a mass movement, and that wasn't a great use of terminology. So I mean totalitarian movement mobilizing the masses. And the other point is the confrontation with the state, right? So Peter countered that, but wait a second, the sort of the predecessor to the movement we're seeing on the right now is the Tea Party movement, which was not a totalitarian movement. And I said that I think it's still a movement primarily, but also it's in confrontation with the state. That's its animating force. And the parallel polis is sort of the idea was born of the need to find a way of relating to the state that's not is constantly confrontational. They weren't suggesting negotiate with the state. That state was not capable of negotiation. But they were saying, step away from confrontation, look for other ways of creating collective action.
But can I just push a little bit, I guess, because I mean, we all, I think many of us are aware, within the kind of conservative ideological sphere, those who supported the Tea Party did view it not as confrontation with the state, but as in restructuring local ideas of government, and very much polis-like. I mean, read David French, or read those who kind of were disappointed by the way it became nationalized under Trump, as representing some very strong contingent that saw it, as they were a part of it, as being something that was very much about creating those spaces.
So maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe the Tea Party began as a good example of a parallel polis.
Question over here.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for this very informative talk. This is Ann Lauterbach. I have a question about whether you think at all about the role of popular culture, music, theater, poetics inside of this parallel polis. I was thinking about the 60s and what a tremendous role some of these manifestations had in bringing a certain point of view back into the main culture. And I think that happened also, obviously, in Czechoslovakia. I was just wondering whether that's part of the way you think yeah, I guess it's a double question. One is whether those artifacts are a kind of parallel polis, and if not, whether they in any way affect the relation of the smaller group to the larger group, as it were, kind of carrying affect.
Right. That's such a great question. I'll have to think more about the second part. The first part, yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially theater, especially in Poland, was such an integral part of creating possibilities of political conversation and creating communities, and the sort of the various theaters in Poland that that were, I think, sort of parallel polises in their own right. Exactly, yeah. And I think we're actually, I mean, I wrote a few years ago about Belarus Free Theater, which is very much a descendant of that theater tradition, which is this sort of political theater in active interaction with folklore and with oral history, and with just sort of creating community through performance, right? So that's still happening in that part of the world, and I think that one of the ways in which it works really importantly is that it creates the possibility of political language where political language has been discredited.
Hi, thank you. Neil Gussman. I wanted to ask, I think I learned the most about the pandemic by paying really careful attention to what doctors did with their lives. So I wanted to ask you, when Trump's inaugurated after stealing the 2024 election, what will you be here to help us form a parallel polis when we're an authoritarian country?
Yeah, that's an incredibly flattering comparison, but I actually, I think that some academic communities are certainly parallel polises, right? And I think I maybe have the very strange, for people who've been in academia longer than I have, experience of every time I'm at a faculty meeting, I think, oh, this is so beautiful. This is this is what an intentional community looks like. You talk about really, seemingly small, unimportant stuff, and it's nitpicking, and it goes on forever, and as a result, it creates this sustained community of people who are in ongoing conversation about how they make this place together. So yeah, here's a good start.
Hi, my name's Douglas Stone. So I'm curious about what you would say about modern China with respect to your ideas, because one of the ideas you said Havel had proposed was that after a while the totalitarian regime they don't sustain their oppression. And China seems to be an experiment in doing that, and they seem to have a good understanding that every social organization that creates cohesion is a threat. So they destroyed the Falun Gong, They are now destroying celebrity culture. They are, they don't allow churches, they don't allow alternative religions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that modern state that has the ability to monitor everything and to, oppress continuously may actually make it very difficult to have anything like a parallel polis. But I'd be interested in how you view that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know enough about China to answer that question well, so I'm going to just make one observation and then maybe pivot. But, the observation is that you have just listed all the things that the Chinese government has had to destroy, which means that parallel polis-like phenomena keep appearing even under these extreme conditions of sustained and really effective totalitarianism. But the question is, the example I gave was beautiful, but also what made me get up here and talk about it was that it's unusual, right? We don't see this sort of thing happen that much, and obviously applying the criterion of success, making it, the ability to replace a totalitarian government, the criterion of success of the parallel polis, is probably unrealistic, and so there have to be other ways of thinking about it. And one example that I follow in the book is this co-living community in Israel called Neve Shalom Bahar al-Salam, which has been in existence for almost 50 years. It's a village where half the families are Jewish Israelis, half the families are Palestinian citizens of Israel. It was originally conceived as a permanent encounter, when encounter was a very meaningful word, and it has created its own school system that has served as a model for several other schools in Israel. It has created also a sort of conflict resolution facilitation technique that it teaches all over the world. And it is a model of a future that I think at this point, certainly none of the founders, but even probably none of the people who have joined in the last 20 years imagine they will see in their lifetimes. Right? But they have the experience of living their lives in a co-living community, in this model of the future. They certainly have the experience of democracy. They also have raised children who are very different members of the larger society, and they do go out into the larger society by and large. And I think they sort of think in biblical time of what's going to be there when eventually that land changes, which it will. Nothing lasts forever, right? And I think that's a lot of what I just was reporting on in Moscow, and there's something incredibly depressing about watching middle-aged grandchildren of dissidents doing work that is incredibly similar to the work that their grandparents did, right? And their grandparents, who were the generation of Havel and Michnik, had a very real expectation of the totalitarian regime falling, and these 40-year-olds don't. Or they think it's a possibility, but they really don't have an expectation of it. And yet they create this meaningful work that creates the future in the present. and also create something that will be there when the larger thing collapses, which it eventually will.
Hi, my name is Margot Viscusi. I have two unrelated questions. And the first is, would you care to comment on the role of philanthropy, which seems to me the
I'm sorry, I can't make up.
Philanthropy, which seems to me the opposite of what you're talking about, in that philanthropic decisions are made by boards, and some of the foundations are making an effort to reach out to involve more people, but it seems to me a very hierarchy that imposes on the society. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. The other one is totally different. It's about social media. And what do you see? Have social media changed the scene? Have they taken the place of the hike on the border, or not?
So, yeah, I don't think that most philanthropic organizations, I think in some ways most philanthropic organizations are actually the very opposite of a parallel polis because of the hierarchical structure, and because there is the separation between those who are helping and those who are being helped, right? Which is very much the opposite of this idea. Social media, you know, there's a reason that these people put themselves in danger and actually made a significant physical effort for which they were not trained to meet in person on a mountaintop when they had the possibility of passing written text back and forth. There's nothing like being in a room together. We know that now more, you know, we experience that more vividly than we ever have before, right? The difference between teaching on Zoom and teaching in person, right? And that's even without all the adverse incentives of social media, which basically incentivizes users to slam the door as loudly as possible, which is the opposite of what happens to you when you're having a political conversation with people in a room together. The incentive is to find a way to stay in the room and stay in the conversation.
Dawn Tripp. One of the things that I found so powerful and transformative about your talk was that it was a story. It's a story drawn from history. It's moving, it's human, and it changed my relationship and changed the lens through which I understood how we could work toward a way forward. And I wondered if you could speak about the work of the writer, the work of one who can take the mass of history, the sort of mass and mess of where we are, and forge that vision for how, yes, we meet in person, we gather in person, but there was a vision that came out of those meetings. There was a vision that came out of the solitary thinkings of the dissidents. And there was a vision that came out of that, that underground communication that emerged as a way forward.
So I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but let me, yeah.
The way narrative, and again, it's a story. Like it's not like it's not a true story, but it's a narrative, and you organized it and told it in a way that changes our relationship to why we're here. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of course, it's a true story, right? But not fiction. But I mean, it's no accident that pretty much everyone I mentioned is a writer. And I think that some movements benefited greatly from having writers tell the story of what this is for, and how we're going to get there, and what is beautiful about what we're doing together now, right? And then Peter asked me earlier whether, I think self-awareness, right? I think you asked, is necessary for a parallel polis. And I think the answer is kind of twofold. No, it's not necessary. You can definitely have a parallel polis if you're not telling a story about it, but somebody has to tell a story about it. Right? Otherwise, it remains an isolated thing, right? Whether it's a story that somebody writes down and tells to many other people, or a story that people tell each other when they're talking about what they're doing, and that's a story that serves to inspire others to do something similar or something entirely different, right? That's still stories.
Hi, I'm going to bring a question from our online community, or rather a comment that tries to connect your talk with sortition, and maybe you can say if you think it's catching the spirit of what you were doing. Wayne Liebman says, the parallel between solidarity and the Velvet Revolution and sortition is this: to the extent democratic lottery confronts or threatens entrenched power, the contest does not resemble an ordinary political battle or even a political revolution. The difference is that a lottery-selected body does not have a political program. Rather, it embodies increased civic participation and deliberative decision-making. They do not address themselves to political leaders or parties, but to each other. They exist at a table, outside or in spite of politics. And the panel creates its own authority and areas of competence as is required. It stands quietly in the new life.
That's really beautiful, and yes, I agree with that completely. And I would add that it also creates a working model of the future in the present.
Question back there, and then others, as we kind of get a sense as we begin to wrap up. All right, these last questions.
Hi, my name's Andy Arnold, and I wonder if you could talk about your metaphor a little bit. Parallel polis. It seems like at some point these parallel polises converge. I imagine a perpendicular polis would attack power directly. A parallel polis seems to only pretend not to attack. It also seems like you're almost describing a Roy Kent version of the parallel polis. It's everywhere, and that at some point it turns towards replacing or attacking those in power.
The what camp version? Sorry.
Sorry, it's a pop culture reference. Roy Kent.
Roy Kent, right? So I think that. And obviously I was summarizing a large amount of writing, but I did mention that they were both advocating for stepping away from confrontation and explicitly not advocating a retreat, right? Sort of going off on to some kind of island or some utopian version of internal exile. So it's not a non-confrontational posture. It's a posture of tending to creating a polis more than tending to confronting the state.
Hello, and thank you for that wonderful conversation. I was thinking earlier about what was said about the challenges of making visible these parallel polis projects, in part because of the scale at which they operate, and the fact that they're operating oftentimes in defiance to these very large totalitarian structures. But if there's also a way in which that same question of visibility can connect to the idea in which the way we measure the impact of these parallel polis projects, that we don't measure them necessarily by scale, but by their ability to generate other types of conversations. And that type of generative reaction, a type of dynamic reaction, might happen across borders and across sort of transnational states. And if so, how do we, that seems to almost require another type of imagining, right? And almost seems like a very literary act, because we're asked to find the connective tissue between different projects that exist in different political spaces. Is it necessary to sort of do that to try to kind of make that constellation of meaning sort of possible in order to keep generating hope within those projects? And is it fair to try to do that across these different political spaces, given the different realities in which those projects might exist?
Yeah, no, that's actually a great set of questions, and that's a lot of what I've been grappling with in this book project. Was first, it was just trying to describe stuff, because it was the first time in my writing life that I would stand and look at something or listen to something like, I have no idea what this is, right? I get a sense that it's beautiful, it's somehow like hopeful, but how do I describe this, right? And it's a real, I mean, it's part of the reason it's taking so long to write this book, but it's also, it's a real struggle to kind of not fall into platitudes and things that as a writer, I probably wouldn't normally be inclined toward, but I so need to find the language to describe things that a lot of the time their creators haven't described that well. Sometimes, when they're really thought through, like the Neva Shalom Wahada Al Salam, that's easy, right? They just tell me exactly what they're doing, and I can describe it. But a lot of the time there isn't sort of ready-made language to describe things, which goes to the question of connective tissue, and that's, yeah, I mean, it puts me as a journalist in the strange position of trying to name things rather than quote people. And, is that fair? Is that allowed? Well, I don't know. Well, I guess when I'm done writing, I'll figure out whether that was a total failure. Ultimately, what I can try to do is sort of make a sound argument for why one thing is like another or unlike another. Sometimes I get lucky and I actually can sort of trace the genealogy of one project to another project, but sometimes I really have to kind of argue through why something is generative, or why something is meaningful, or how something is meaningful rather, and also, of course, it's a very insightful question about sort of the cross-border creativity or generativity, because at first I thought, oh, I should write about like other ways of thinking about borders, because that's a topic that I'm very interested in, and obviously different ways of thinking about citizenship. So I started going to all these border projects to try to figure it out, and then I realized this is not working. Like, all these border projects are just making more border. By sort of facilitating border crossings or border cross-border communication, but it's not making a different way of thinking about border. It's just making the border even more central. And then I realized that sort of thinking about more kind of checkerboard connections across borders was much more useful, but it also required a different kind of research, because these weren't always connections that I could trace by talking to people. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Roger. Yeah, Masha, this was a fascinating talk and conversation. And when I was listening to you, 3 different things popped into my head, and I have no idea if you're going to find them totally off base or not. But the first was an interview done with a French woman shortly after World War II, where people asked, you know, how do you feel? And she said, well, I sort of feel lost because I was in the resistance, and afterwards I feel like my life is meaningless. And the second is James Scott's works on anarchism, especially his book on anarchism in East Asia, Southeast Asia, where he argues that you can only have anarchism in sort of interstices, not in states, sort of in the mountain villages and places in between states. And then third is David Graeber's work on anarchism and his idea that you find spaces of freedom in resistance, but never in government. And, you know, it does, you know, again, here's where you may find what I'm saying crazy, but it does strike me that there's a kind of almost desire for resistance, desire for a state that one needs to fight against, and almost a fear of trying to build a state that that is not perfect, but that we want to live in. And I'm wondering if I'm right in that, and how you react to that.
It's a great question, and I do have thoughts on this because it's something that I've thought about a lot in my own life, and also in my writing life. I mean, I was just talking to somebody in Moscow who said, I'm in a codependent relationship with the state. That, you know, I lie in bed being totally depressed. And this is somebody who runs a huge, very important resistance project. So, you know, I lie in bed being depressed, and then they do something really awful, and suddenly I'm energized, and I can do all this meaningful work for 2 weeks, and then I'm back in bed being depressed. So so you don't even have to wait for the war to end to experience the codependence. But I think the less flippant answer and the more interesting one is that we never actually build a state that we want to live in. We're always in the process. I mean, if we're lucky, we're always in the process of building a state that we might want to live in, which is really what these Parallel Polis projects are about. Is they're about the ongoing creation of spaces that we want to inhabit with one another. And that's, you know, that's the dream of democracy. It's that it's not that it's here and we can experience it right now and tomorrow and in a guaranteed way tomorrow, right? It's that we experience the process of creating it.
So I think we want to wrap up, right? Because I think we've gone over time slightly. So let me thank Masha. I think if one of the characteristics that she's searching for is generativity, I think there was a lot of generativity here, and I think we'll all be continuing this conversation. So thank you.